great week so far. I hope everything's going well for you. I'm doing pretty well, still healthy, still sane, haven't lost my mind just yet. I am missing you a lot, and that does occasionally make me pretty sad. But I'm looking forward to being able to see you again, hopefully soon. Well, let's go ahead and get right on into it. First thing I want to do is shout out from our last week's video comment challenge. The question that we had was, which two crops were the most significant to the economy in the South? We know that in the South, in the 1800s, the agriculture, this is the culture of farming, of raising crops, of raising livestock, this was the culture that was really taking root, and it became the backbone of their economy. This was how they made and spent money. And there were two major crops that really helped to kind of kick this off, and those two crops were, you guessed it, cotton and tobacco. Tobacco obviously introduced by John Rolfe in the Jamestown settlement. Native Americans had been using tobacco in a lot of different ways too, but John Rolfe figured out a specific hybrid plant of tobacco that would grow really well in Virginia, and that spread throughout the South. Cotton similarly grew really well in the climate and in the soil in the South. Eli Whitney produces and patents a machine called the cotton gin, and this helps to process the cotton. Raw cotton you can't really use just like it is, it has to be processed. So the cotton gin helped to process, to pull the seeds out, to help to clean it. It was part of that process. So this made cotton much more readily available. Lots of people wanted it because they wanted to be able to use it to make cloth for fabric and clothes and that sort of thing. So shout out to Avonlea and Danielle. Thank you guys so much for participating. Cotton and tobacco, two very important crops in the South in the 1800s. Let's go ahead and jump right on in to Social Studies, Week 7. Learning experience number 1 says, as agriculture grew in the South, so did the population of enslaved Africans. Let's take a look at our primary source here. Now, looking at this map, we can see that there's two things being represented here, and we're just going to jump right into the questions. Number 1, first question says, what does this map depict? What does this map depict? And the answer to that question is that this map depicts the number of enslaved peoples living in southern states, both in 1790, which is very shortly after the United States won its independence from Great Britain, and also a map of the enslaved peoples living in southern states in 1860. Now, we can tell this just by looking at some of the features of this map, like the key, the actual images that are depicted. We see that it's a map that shows primarily just the southern states, but we also notice that color coding. But primarily, when we're looking to figure out what is this map showing us, we need to look at the title. That tells us the main idea of that particular document. And for this map, the title tells us exactly what this map is depicting, the population of enslaved people in the South. Number 2 says, compare the 1790 box with the 1860 map. How did the population of enslaved peoples change over time? And if we look and compare these two, you'll see that the 1790 map not only shows a smaller portion of the United States, because this is a little bit fresh into the Revolutionary period, and so we don't have as many federally recognized states just yet, but as you can see, there's also not a very high population of enslaved people. What we can see from 1790 to 1860 is that in 1860 we see an explosion in the population of enslaved peoples living in the southern states. So what we can say about the change over time is that the population of enslaved peoples in the South grew. It grew exponentially. It means it grew a lot. It multiplied over and over again. And how do we know that? There's a color coding system. If you take a look at this key that's right down here in the bottom left-hand corner of your map, you'll see that the color coding system is showing us the percentage of slaves in the total population. So let's say, for instance, you have 100 people living in a particular area. If there are 10 to 30% of those people who are enslaved, then that means that 10 to 30 people of that 100 are enslaved people. If there are 30 to 50% of people who are enslaved, that means that out of 100 people, 30 to 50 of those people would be enslaved. And if you have a group of 100 people and you have 50% or more who are enslaved, then that means that there are 50 or more enslaved people living in those territories. So as we look at the 1860 map, we can see that in those southern states, particularly in the southeastern portions of Virginia, where we live now, in South Carolina, in Georgia, in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas. These are places where we have a very heavy slave population. A lot of those pockets in those states had 50% or more people in their population enslaved. That meant that for every one person who was free, there was one or maybe even more people who were enslaved. And number 3 says, what can you infer led to this change in population of enslaved peoples? Well, there's a couple different things that we can infer led to this, but the biggest thing that we know for sure is that the agriculture increased in the South so much. And this is just a result of more and more territory being opened up, more and more territory being taken from Native Americans. More and more people started moving to that land and setting up farms and plantations. So the agriculture, the culture of raising livestock, of raising and harvesting and growing plants, that would grow, and it was growing exponentially. But we also know that the Industrial Revolution had already taken place at this time. And while the South was more agricultural than it was industrial, a lot of the inventions that came out of the Industrial Revolution made farming a lot easier. And at the same time, a lot of the processing for the things that were being made and farmed and harvested in the South were being sent to northern states to be processed and turned into different kinds of materials in their industrial factories. So this is going to lead agriculture to grow, and that's going to lead a lot of southern plantation owners and farmers to want to have more slave labor so that they can increase the amount of product that they're creating and not have to pay their labor force at all. And finally, number 4, which says, what does this map lead you to conclude about the South's reliance on slave labor? And this is one of those questions where the answer is kind of tucked into the question itself. But as we look at this map, we can see that the southern states, almost all of them, have the majority of their state is colored in with that dark green, where there's 50% or more of their population is made up of enslaved people. So what this tells me about the South's reliance on slave labor is that their economy probably would not have grown as quickly or as strongly as it did without slave labor. Does that mean that they needed slave labor? No, I don't believe that that's what it means. I think that what that means is that they grew accustomed to a culture and to a system that relied on free labor from people. And so as a result, I think that this led to a major increase in the number of enslaved people. For learning experience number 2, we see that the issue of slavery continued to cause tensions between the North and the South, and we have a couple of questions that they wanted us to answer in response to this. Number 1, Northerners and Southerners had differing opinions on slave labor. Why do you think these differing opinions caused problems as the U.S. expanded west? One of the big things is that they disagreed about whether those new states should be considered free states, where they would not allow slavery to take place, or whether they would be considered slave states. So they had major disagreements on this. But another part of it was that there was a lot of moral and philosophical disagreement about whether slavery was right or wrong. Number 2 says to write a cause and effect statement to show your understanding of the section called a new leader. You could have written all kinds of different cause and effect statements. Here's one that I came up with. Let's see how yours compares to mine. The Republican Party formed because many free soilers and Northerners wanted to keep slavery from expanding. So what we can see here is our cause, which is that many free soilers, this is people who want new states to be free states, not slave states. So many of these free soilers wanted the new states that were being admitted into the United States to be considered free. They did not want them to be slave states. As this differing opinion grew and became stronger and more people latched onto it, a new political party emerges. And this political party is still around today. The Republican Party started out as a party that was specifically dedicated to making sure that slavery did not expand into the new states. And number 3, which says in 3 to 4 sentences, describe what life was like for free persons of color in the 1850s. We're supposed to do this after reading the section in your packet called Black Slavery, Black Freedom. 1 in every 10, which is equivalent to about 10%, of Africans living in the United States were free. Now, some of them were born free because at that particular time, your status as an African American, whether you were going to be free or enslaved, was based on your mother's status. It didn't matter what your father's status was, but your mother's status would determine whether you would be considered a slave or whether you would be considered free. But some were free by other ways. Some were set free by their owners for specific reasons. Some bought their freedom by working other jobs and paying their owners to let them free. And some freed themselves by escaping. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about abolitionists, when we talked about Harriet Tubman and people who self-freed themselves. They were able to run away and escape into states where slavery was not legal. Free African Americans still were oppressed, however. They were still being discriminated against, and they were not able to enjoy the same rights and privileges as their white counterparts. So voting rights, access to schools, and just basic racist discrimination was something that was not only prevalent within the ways that people treated each other, but it was also coded into the laws of every state and the federal government, where African Americans just did not have the same rights. And freedom was fragile for African Americans. African Americans could be enslaved for just making tiny little mistakes. The kind of mistakes that might get you a fine or maybe a small short jail sentence for African Americans often meant that they would be sold right back into slavery. But then at the same time, many of them were just straight up kidnapped and sold back into slavery. And for our very last learning experience for week 7, we were supposed to read page 115 and then complete the quick check. I'm going to show you my quick check. Now, what I've done is I've taken all of these statements and I've basically put them into a chart. So I have a chart that signifies the North and a chart that signifies the South, and I've categorized the statements according to that. So here's a quick look at that. And as I have this up, you can use this to check yourself, and I'll just kind of give you some background knowledge as you do. The conflicts between the North and the South eventually boiled over. In December of 1860, South Carolina decides to secede. They decide to break away legally from the United States, and many other states followed right after them. They would form their own country known as the Confederate States of America. Shortly after this, there was a presidential election, and that new leader of the Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln, wins a sweeping victory in the United States, and he becomes the president as the Republican Party takes control of the federal government. This makes a lot of the southern states, and the slave states in particular, very afraid that their rights to decide how they were going to have slaves, or if they would have slaves at all, was going to be taken from them. The Confederate States banded together and they launched an attack on a United States fort. This fort was a very important site. It housed lots of soldiers and other workers for the government, but it also held a lot of weapons, ammunition, that kind of thing. This assault was launched on Fort Sumter by the Confederate States, and Abraham Lincoln decides to mobilize some volunteer soldiers to go down to defend the fort. This was the first show of force from either side, the first official show of force. And so this kind of gave Abraham Lincoln the green light to use force against the Confederate States. And this is what launches the Civil War. So when Virginia made its decision to secede, there was a large portion of Virginia that did not agree and did not want to secede. This led to the creation of a new state. My comment challenge question for you this week is, what was the name of that newly formed state? It's a bonus video this week as well. This video is just going to help to give you some more background knowledge to help tie these pieces together. You certainly don't have to watch it. It's not going to necessarily give you answers to any of your learning packet material, but it might give you some extra information, some background knowledge to help you understand how this conflict took place and why it took place. So this bonus video is going to be called Slavery, Secession, and States' Rights. Slavery, secession, and states' rights. I want to talk with you a little bit about how these three things all kind of work together and correct some misunderstandings that a lot of people have about the Civil War and why it started. So check that video out if you'd like. Post a comment to answer the comment challenge, and I cannot wait to send you guys another video next week. Take care. Have a great week, everyone.